For the cracking of the lips through cold or through wind, anoint them with honey. Then strew upon the powder of pine resin, and the lips swell, if they do, make an ointment of the juice of parsnip leaves and protoxide of lead. Mix together and therewith anoint the lips. For you, my friend who dwells with the fairies, will not have problems with lips. You can drink at roses and at lavender without fear of these matters, but as for me, as a mere queen, I must resolve these things. For the stinking of the mouth comes sometimes a corruption of the gums and of the teeth. It comes of the stomach other times, or of the lungs. If it comes of the teeth and the gums, rub the gums with your finger and see if your finger stinks. If it comes from the stomach, the mouth stinks while the man is fasting, and all the while his mouth is open, you will smell the stink. If it comes out of the lungs, you will smell the stink through the mouth, even when it's closed. But you see, Mr. Butterfly, this is all about men, and it does proclaim that men do stink, for you will notice there is not a woman's name given here. No wonder I remain a virgin.
Henry Tudor had one of the worst hereditary claims to the throne of any English monarch. It was almost no claim at all. He was the son of Edmund Tudor, who was the lower-born half-brother of Henry VI, through Henry's mother, Catherine of Valois, who had married Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire.
Now, his claim to the throne was rather tenuous.
Henry VI gave his half-brother a semi-royal bride. And this was Margaret Beaufort, who was a descendant of John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III, so close to the Lancastrian royal house. But crucially, she was a Beaufort, and John of Gaunt's Beaufort children were all born illegitimate. They were born to Catherine Swynford, a woman who would later become his third wife, but not until his second wife had died, and not until their large family were already adults. So the Beauforts were illegitimate. They were legitimised by the Pope, and they were legitimised by the King, but there was always a question mark over whether they actually had a claim to the throne. Henry IV of England, John of Gaunt's legitimate son, certainly seems to have taken issue with the idea that the Beauforts could one day succeed to the crown.
So not only was his claim an illegitimate one, but it also only came through his mother.
However, with the death of Henry VI and the death of his son Edward of Lancaster, the next heir to the House of Lancaster, if you consider the Beauforts to be legitimate, was Margaret Beaufort. And so it was through this very tenuous connection that Henry Tudor was able to claim the throne. Henry Tudor was born in Wales and had very strong Welsh descent, and he spent some of his childhood in Wales. However, as the potential heir to the House of Lancaster, he was always going to struggle under Edward IV's Yorkist regime. Eventually, he flees with his uncle Jasper Tudor to Brittany, where he spends most of his latter childhood and much of his early adult life. He is in exile. Very few people in England actually really know who he is because he spends so much time. And really it's his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who remains behind in England, who really pushes his candidacy for the throne. She is able to ally herself with Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV, and of course the mother of the Prince in the Tower. And she agrees with Elizabeth that if Henry marries Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York, the Yorkist supporters will support Henry's candidacy for the throne. And this is enough for Henry, who has by then fled to France, to gather a force of mercenaries and land in Pembrokeshire in 1485. And he meets the forces of Richard III in August at the Battle of Bosworth Field.
The odds really were stacked against Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth. Not only did Richard III have the support of the nobles and a much larger army, he was also a seasoned warrior, whereas Henry Tudor had much less experience.
Difficult sometimes to know exactly what's going on during the battle, but we know that it was very, very fierce fighting. Richard III very much got involved in the fighting. In fact, at one point he kills Henry Tudor's standard bearer with his own hands. During the battle, the Stanleys, who have their own large army, have been waiting to see what the outcome of the battle is likely to be. They are closely related to Henry Tudor through his mother, who has married Lord Stanley. Eventually, they join the battle on Henry's side, which is the decisive moment. Richard III is killed.
He was slain on the battlefield, and the triumphant ascendance of Henry Tudor.
By the end of the day, Henry Tudor has been declared King Henry VII. Henry, as far as we can tell, never takes a mistress, which is quite unusual for a king, and suggests that he is content in his own wife's bed. Certainly they have 7 children, and these children are raised to be the heirs of the Tudor dynasty. Prince Arthur is their eldest, and he is the future of the dynasty. Henry focuses all his efforts on this child. He is born at Winchester because Henry wants to place the dynasty within Arthurian legend. He wants to use ideas of the legendary king of the Britons to attach to his dynasty, because of course the Tudors are Welsh, the descendants of the Britons. So Arthur is named Arthur to reference King Arthur, and he's raised in his own household, and he's raised to become king.
Arthur, Prince of Wales, was supposed to be the heir that succeeded to Henry Tudor, and much hope and expectation lay on his shoulders.
Now, there was much talk about Arthur being a frail creature. Well, later on he was, but not when he was younger. But he was tall, blonde, got the Plantagenet blonde. Don't forget his mother is Elizabeth of York. Yes, there is a right to be on the throne.
In order to secure the realm and to have alliances with other countries, he was also married to the Infanta of Spain, Catherine of Aragon.
But what Henry of England wanted was recognition from a new dynasty arriving on the throne. To be accepted by Spain was a huge deal. He also wanted the money. He was parsimonious. I think Henry VII was actually a great monarch in terms of stability, in terms of setting things right, organising this, that and the other. He said he was going to end the War of the Roses, and he did.
But tragically, their marriage was to be a short-lived one, for Arthur contracted the sweating sickness and died suddenly in 1502.
Unfortunately, Arthur dies as a teenager, shortly after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This is devastating both for Henry and for Elizabeth. So Henry is left with just one surviving son, young Henry VIII, and also two daughters, Margaret, who becomes Queen of Scots, and Mary, who will briefly become Queen of France during the reign of her brother. All of Henry's energies then focus on young Henry, and he seems to have been a very overprotective father, with good reason, of course, because he's seen his eldest son die. He keeps young Henry cloistered away like a young maiden.
Henry's life changed dramatically upon the death of his brother Arthur. From having been the spare, he was now the heir, and all of England's hopes rested upon his shoulders.
Henry VII was never a popular king. Most of his court feared him. So on his death, there is a sense of celebration, of joy that England is now going to get this young and charismatic king.
When Henry VIII ascended to the throne, one of his first acts was to ask his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, for her hand in marriage. This was incredibly expedient. It meant that England could retain a good relationship with Spain. But in order to do so, Henry had to petition the Pope for a license, essentially, a dispensation to marry his dead brother's wife.
This actually places the couple within the prohibited degrees of affinity according to church law. So basically it means that they are as related as far as the church is concerned as though they were brother and sister, so they cannot legally marry. To get round this point, Catherine's parents obtain a dispensation for her to marry Henry, which is a very common way of permitting a marriage between closely related people.
So the Pope had to give his permission for Henry and Catherine to marry, which indeed he did grant.
Then one day the Winter King was dead, and standing there was Henry VIII, the Summer King.
Henry VIII very much resembled his grandfather, Edward IV, who'd been very, very popular. And there is a real sense of hope for the future. He's seen as a true Renaissance prince. He's highly educated. He's incredibly good looking. The young Henry VIII was described as so beautiful, he'd make a pretty woman. He is a king of which England can be proud, and there is very much celebration at his accession to the throne in 1509.
Younger than her, he danced with her at her wedding feast to Arthur when he was 10. And there he was, big and beautiful and golden. And he was, don't think he's just an old man throwing chicken legs. He was a spectacularly beautiful, fit young man. And they were happy. And a jewel recently found proves the admiration and love.
Catherine in many ways was an ideal queen consort.
Catherine rarely puts a foot wrong as queen consort. She acts as regent of England.
She was supportive of Henry and his many campaigns abroad, but she was also happy to be subservient to him. She knew that one of her chief responsibilities was to secure the succession, and she was certainly happy to be supportive of Henry in every aspect of his duties.
It was one dead child after another for them. One after another, the following year, next year. One, a boy lived for 52 days, some say 50, and then he was dead. Bonfires had been lit in celebration, it was too late. 1513, while Henry was away, she got on a horse when she was part pregnant in a wonderful hat that was armour, brass like this, we'd think of it like a summer straw hat, but round the brim here was a crown. Come, come, she said, troops. For James of Scotland had raided England while Henry was away, laying a city under siege. So up she goes, there on a horse. Come, come, raise them up, raise them up. She'd been allowed by Henry to raise money and command the troops. He must have admired her enormously, her great intellect. And so what happened? That was the Battle of Flodden. And England won, and she made a speech, some say, that Elizabeth based her speech on. But in the end she was rejected.
Henry VIII was actually quite slow in his advances towards Anne Boleyn, who joined his court in 1522. He actually had a relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, in the interim years before he turned his attentions towards her. But we know for certain by 1526 that Henry VIII was falling head over heels in love for Anne Boleyn.
It's clear that Henry was deeply in love with Anne. We can see it in his love letters. We can see it in his conduct, the fact that he was prepared to break England away from the Pope and to annul a marriage to the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, who's the most powerful man in Europe.
The only real way that Henry was going to be able to marry Anne was if the Pope would annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon.
Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon on the basis that she had been his brother's wife. So they're related to within the first degree of affinity. They are, as far as the church is concerned, brother and sister. And his argument is that you cannot dispense such a marriage.
And indeed, when you look at Leviticus in the Bible, which is what he depended on, Henry VIII, you've got all these scholars looking everywhere for an excuse to get out of the Catherine of Aragon marriage. And there it is. There's a finger pointing from a cloud, some marginalia, which is worth seeing. And it says, thou shalt not uncover thy brother's wife's nakedness, or thou shalt not bear fruit.
What is quite ironic is that when he first sends to the Pope to request his annulment, his messenger also has a second request for a dispensation to allow him to marry a woman within the first degree of affinity to him. And this is because his sexual relationship with Mary Boleyn has created the same relationship between him and Anne that exists between him and Catherine of Aragon.
And of course, Catherine of Aragon had been married to Arthur, his elder brother. Henry seemed to sort of forget, which was a bit of a habit with him, that he'd had a sexual relationship with Anne Boleyn's sister, but don't let that get in the way kind of thing. Which is probably why Anne Boleyn was accused of witchcraft, amongst other things.
It's an ironic point, but I think it also demonstrates very, very clearly that his reasons for annulling the marriage to Catherine were not sincere, and that actually he wanted rid of her because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Anne and Henry placed their hopes in Cardinal Wolsey, and he was dispatched to Rome to try to bring about the annulment.
Wolsey ultimately fails to secure an annulment for Henry from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Where Wolsey had failed, Anne herself held the key. She was incredibly bold and placed in the king's hands a copy of William Tyndale's The Obedience of the Christian Man. This book told Henry that there was no pope in Rome, there was no authority in Rome, and that the king was next to God. This really sowed the seeds in Henry's mind that he was above the Pope, that he could form his own church in England.
As soon as Thomas Cranmer is confirmed as Archbishop of Canterbury, he breaks his oath to the Pope and declares the English church separate from Rome, with the king as its supreme head. And this is the moment that the English church goes its own way.
After Henry had annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, she was banished from court. Henry had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, and the price for crowning her was the delivery of the much longed for male heir that Henry so desired. But the child that Anne had in 1533 wasn't a son, it was a daughter, the future Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth is just the most fascinating figure. She is born the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she is a crushing disappointment because of course she isn't a boy. She spends a difficult childhood and a difficult early adulthood really trying to find her place in the line of succession and in the royal family.
Now, some historians have suggested that Henry was furious at Anne for the delivery of a daughter, and indeed that this was the beginning of the end of their relationship. But actually we have good evidence that Henry consoled Anne and suggested that the delivery of a healthy daughter was a good sign for the sons that would follow. Anne was under enormous pressure at this point. She had almost absorbed all of the pressure that had been on Catherine of Aragon's shoulders onto her own.
At the start of 1536, Anne was pregnant. News then came that Catherine of Aragon had died, and Henry and Anne celebrated by wearing yellow at court. And this must have felt like a high point for Anne Boleyn. It had been a difficult previous year. However, on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, she miscarried, and it was obvious to people at court that this had been a son. Henry told Anne that he could see that he would have no more boys by her, which was particularly ominous.
And I think this is the beginning of the end of Anne's life.
Henry, by this stage, was involved with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who had herself declared that she would not become the king's mistress. He seems to have promised to marry Jane before Anne's downfall.
Very dramatically, on the 2nd of May 1536, Anne is arrested at the Palace of Greenwich and is taken to the Tower of London. In truth, there was absolutely no foundation for any of the charges held against Anne. The simple fact of the matter is that Henry wanted out of his marriage to Anne, and he knew that Anne would not go quietly. On the 19th of May, Anne was led from her apartments at the Tower of London at 8 AM to a scaffold that had been erected on Tower Green. Everything that was to happen to Anne on that day had been carefully planned by her husband, Henry.
Henry is clearly the driving force behind the decision to rid himself of Anne and take a new wife.
And as she mounted the scaffold steps, it was noted by observers that she looked calm, and some even said that she had never looked so beautiful. Henry ordered that a cannon was fired at the moment that Anne was executed, and this was his cue to move on. Indeed, he proposed to Jane Seymour the next day, and they were married only 2 weeks later.
It is a marriage that he hopes will bear sons, and he's hopeful that Jane will prove a very different wife to Anne Boleyn.
Compared to Henry's first two queens, Jane Seymour was rather less complicated. She was rather meek and slightly milder than Catherine and Anne, and was certainly happy to be more pliant to Henry's will.
Finally, at the start of 1537, Jane realises she's pregnant, and when she feels the baby quicken, so she feels the baby move, the whole country erupts into celebration.
In 1537, after many years of heartache, Jane Seymour finally gave Henry the son and heir that he so desperately craved.
When Jane goes into labour in October 1537, the whole country hold their breath, and it's a very long, very arduous labour. Finally, after 2 days, Jane gives birth, and it is a healthy prince, and everybody celebrates.
Henry was elated. There was much celebration throughout the kingdom, and lavish feasts and jousts were prepared.
This is the moment that Henry has been waiting for nearly 30 years. He is absolutely thrilled.
But tragically, all was not well in the birthing chamber, for in less than 2 weeks, his beloved Queen Jane was dead.
Most kings in the period chose their wives for diplomatic reasons. They wanted to make a grand foreign alliance which would bring friendship between the countries.
Henry's kingdom was rather less secure than it should be because of his newly founded Church of England. Therefore, Cromwell's proposal was to create an alliance with a Protestant country, and he looked abroad to Cleves as a potential match for this alliance.
It would mean that England was no longer isolated and at threat of war.
He dispatched the king's painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to create a likeness of Anne of Cleves, who was a princess there. And upon return, Henry VIII was rather pleased with this painting. It showed a rather young and beautiful young woman.
And Henry, on the receipt of Anne's portrait, was keen to go ahead. The marriage contract was signed in September 1539, and Anne then made her way towards England.
Henry VIII's first meeting with Anne of Cleves couldn't have gone worse. Anne was supposed to voyage to court to meet Henry, but like a lovesick boy, Henry can't wait to meet her and decides to visit her in disguise. And when Henry VIII burst into her chamber, she was completely unimpressed with this man that stood before her. And I think actually in that moment, Henry VIII saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, a genuine reaction to how unattractive he had become. Anne hadn't recognised him as this all-powerful, majestic person. She'd simply seen an obese and slightly ageing man before her. Their relationship thereafter was something of a disaster. Henry would exit that chamber claiming, "I like her not," and suggesting that she was nothing like the portrait that had been presented to her.
He couldn't risk offending the Duke of Cleves and the Schmalkaldic League as well. So he had to go through the wedding. He had to put his neck in the yoke, as he said on his wedding day. He and Anne married, and he attempted to make the best of the situation. They tried to consummate the marriage. But Henry, again, his mind was closed to Anne. He just couldn't do it.
Anne of Cleves certainly wasn't afforded a coronation. For 6 months later, Henry VIII had their marriage annulled. Anne of Cleves was gifted a lavish portfolio of properties, a great income, and was gifted a new title, the King's Sister. Having served Henry loyally for many years, Thomas Cromwell was now seen by the king as the architect of this incredibly awkward marriage between Anne of Cleves and himself, and he really blamed Cromwell. Noticing how vulnerable Cromwell now was, waiting in the wings was the Duke of Norfolk, who had never been fond of Cromwell. And he had a niece who was in Anne of Cleves' employ, Catherine Howard. He saw this as an opportunity not only to place his young niece in the king's bed, but also to bring down Cromwell. Cromwell has been sent to the Tower of London in disgrace, and he isn't even afforded a trial. He is actually condemned to death by an act of attainder. In his last letter to King Henry VIII, he writes a postscript at the end of the letter, begging 3 times for mercy, mercy, mercy. But no mercy came, and Thomas Cromwell was taken to the public scaffold site on Tower Hill and beheaded on the very day that the king married Catherine Howard.
Catherine Howard is really Henry VIII's midlife crisis. She'd been a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. She's a teenager.
Henry VIII is absolutely besotted by Catherine. He lavishes gifts upon her, jewellery and clothes. But soon rumours start at court that all is not well with Catherine's past.
She was a woman with a past, or a girl with a past really. She'd had 2 previous lovers, one of which had been consummated.
And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, leaves a letter for the king to find, which details some troubling facts about Catherine's past. At first, Henry VIII is entirely dismissive of these claims, but he does order that Thomas Cranmer investigate. But then things take a turn for the worse. A letter is discovered in the possession of Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry VIII's favourites at court. This is a romantic letter. It talks of Catherine longing to see him, and this sends Henry into an absolute rage. He is blinded by this rage and suggests that he is going to kill Catherine with his own sword. She is confined to her apartments and then is imprisoned at Sion Abbey. But rather unlike Anne, who is dispatched within 19 days of her arrest, Catherine languishes in prison. Henry can't quite believe what has happened. It is reported at this time that there is no more room in the Tower of London for it is so full of Howard relatives. And eventually Catherine is taken herself to the Tower of London. She is taken to the Queen's apartments and is afforded a private execution on Tower Green. Henry VIII's sixth and final queen was Catherine Parr. Catherine was a relatively young woman when Henry first took notice of her, but actually she had already been twice widowed.
She was very, very reluctant to marry Henry and actually seems to have been quite horrified when he declared his interest in her. Henry, however, would not be refused. There are claims that Catherine actually said it was better to be his mistress than his wife, but if that was the case, he ignored her and insisted on marriage.
I think at this point in his life, Henry is looking for peace and stability and looks to Catherine Parr to rehabilitate his family life, to bring his children together and to bring harmony once more to the royal family. Catherine Parr is an incredibly intelligent woman. She is very well read and has very radical religious ideas too. She's also the first queen to ever publish a book and the first woman to publish a book in England under her own name and in English.
Henry VIII had been ill on and off for the latter part of 1546, and just before Christmas he leaves the Queen and his daughter Mary and goes to Westminster. And it's clear very quickly that he's dying. He spends his last few weeks cloistered away with his council, and particularly his secretary William Paget, who is very close to Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, the brother of Queen Jane, and the uncle of the heir to the throne. During this period, Henry asks that a new will is drawn up. He'd previously made a will in the early days of his marriage to Catherine Parr, and he seems to have named her as regent in the event of his death. But this new will completely overturned that. Instead of naming anyone as regent, Henry in fact established a council of equal ranking executors. So all of these men have an equal role to play. And it was hoped that they would guide Edward through his minority and into his adult reign. Edward VI was the last Tudor king. And obviously he came to the throne as a child. He's 9 years old. He's a shy, uncertain boy at his succession.
Edward VI was a highly intelligent young man. He was well versed in most subjects, and he was also a radical religious thinker. This was certainly encouraged by his uncles who shared the Protestant faith. In fact, he was something of a religious zealot, and unlike his father, who remained a traditional Catholic, Edward imposed a fully Protestant Reformation on England for the first time.
Matures as a ruler in his 6 years. There are just signs, there are just hints of the monarch that he could have become.
Edward is a boy king and a fiercely Protestant one too. And his heir at the time is his elder sister Mary, who is a devout Catholic and a Roman Catholic too. This causes enormous tensions between the two. Their differences are so great that Edward cannot conceive of his sister Mary succeeding to the throne and undoing the Protestant Reformation that he has enacted upon the country, and he goes to great lengths in order to disinherit his sister from the line of succession.
He unfortunately dies at the age of 15, but his legacy is certainly the Protestant Reformation, because it is under Edward that Protestantism becomes established in England. When we think about Edward, we often think of him as a boy king, as a footnote to the reign of his father, but actually the Protestant Reformation really should set his reign apart, and we should look more closely at just what Edward achieved.
In the wake of Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey is suddenly proclaimed Queen and is taken to the Tower of London, which is usually at the centre of political power at the point of a coronation. But Jane is only to reign for a mere 9 days, for Mary has the support of the kingdom and also of the nobles. Mary proclaims herself Queen at Framlingham Castle, and she writes to the nobility to ask for their support, and support them they do. Mary rides triumphantly into London, and rather than occupying the palace apartments at the Tower of London, Lady Jane Grey becomes a prisoner. She will only leave the Tower of London for her trial later on, and sadly, the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey is beheaded. When Mary came to the throne, one of her first actions was to finally marry, and she chose for her husband King Philip II of Spain.
And it's a really good match for Mary. He is the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, so one of the most powerful princes in Europe. And Mary has always been very close to her Spanish relatives, and so she is very, very excited by her marriage to Philip.
Mary was desperate to beget a son and heir to secure her own succession.
Unfortunately, it is an incredibly unpopular marriage in England, because in the 16th century, the husband of a queen is a king. So whoever Mary marries will become King of England, and nobody wants a Spanish king. Early in 1554, there is a great rebellion against Mary. It is led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, and it begins in Kent.
Thomas Wyatt rebels in favour of Princess Elizabeth ascending to the throne.
Wyatt marches his troops up to London, and actually it's a very, very dangerous situation for Mary, and she is urged to flee her capital by her advisors. She refuses and actually makes a speech at the Guildhall in London, and it's absolutely the speech of her life. And we can see Elizabeth modelling later speeches on this. Mary talks about being married to her country, and it really rallies the people of London in her support, so that when Wyatt's troops cross the river into London, they are met with a substantial army, and they are defeated that day.
Mary believes that Elizabeth is part of this conspiracy and arrests her sister, imprisoning her in the Tower of London. Indeed, it is likely she is held in the very same rooms that her mother was once held in. This must have been terrifying for Elizabeth. However, Mary ultimately knew that Elizabeth was her only heir. There was no one else to succeed her, so therefore she had no choice but to let Elizabeth go.
Mary believed that she came to the throne with God's favour, that God had supported her. So she sees her queenship as divinely inspired. So it seems only natural that she will give birth to a Catholic heir to the throne to keep her half-sister away from the crown.
Mary was determined to have a son and heir, and at one point she believed very much that she was pregnant.
So she has all the symptoms of pregnancy. The doctors agree. Everyone is very, very excited. And so she waits, and then she waits, and she waits some more, and nothing happens.
Tragically, this was a phantom pregnancy, and no children ever came from her marriage to Philip.
By the start of 1558, it is clear that it's only a matter of time before Elizabeth takes the throne. Mary is not going to have a child, and her health is declining.
Mary has gone down in history as Bloody Mary, which I think is particularly unkind. She was England's first queen regnant who reigned in her own right. So I think it's uniquely unfair and even misogynistic to land Mary with this really unfortunate title.
Towards the end of the summer, people start flocking towards Elizabeth at Hatfield, and it's almost a court in waiting. Even the Spanish ambassador goes to see her and reports back to Philip of her confidence that she will soon become queen. In November, Mary falls ill, and she dies in an influenza outbreak in London.
After only 5 years on the throne and having provided no heir, Mary died in 1558, leaving her throne begrudgingly to her Protestant sister, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth is immediately proclaimed queen, and she is told at Hatfield while she is sitting reading under an oak tree. Given the fact that it's November and it's very, very cold, this looks very much like a stage scene, that she is waiting to be told that she is now queen.
She said to William Cecil, he was already very senior in her household when she was declared queen on the 27th of November, 1558, under an oak tree by tradition at Hatfield. You must tell me what I don't want to hear. Do you hear that? How clever was that?
And there aren't really any other candidates. In France, Mary, Queen of Scots, declares herself Queen of England, but actually almost everyone, Catholic or Protestant, throws their support in England behind Elizabeth.
There was something of a sigh of relief in the country, who had been exposed to quite radical measures in order to enact the counter-Reformation to return the country back to the Catholic faith. And they hoped that the young Elizabeth would provide more stability, more peace and harmony.
But she's met by cheering crowds. She is Henry VIII's daughter, and in fact her coronation portrait is very much reminiscent of her father. She's displaying herself as Henry VIII's daughter.
as I am surrounded by the greatest minds this nation can give, who will protect all. I won't have the Scotch Queen for one moment take you away from me.
Tudor women had very few rights. They were expected to marry, and they would then become effectively the property of their husbands. They had no legal personhood, so they can't even own any property. Everything they own passes to their husband. And it's broadly similar for a queen. Although a reigning queen does retain some authority, their husband will become king and will be deferred to and become the dominant party. And we can see this with Mary I, who marries Philip of Spain, and he becomes King of England. We can see this in Scotland, where Mary, Queen of Scots, marries Henry, Lord Darnley, and he becomes King Henry of Scots. So Elizabeth is expected to marry and give England a king.
I think Elizabeth chose not to marry for a number of different reasons. I think it began at an early age. I think she knew from the example set by firstly her mother and then her stepmother, Catherine Howard, how vulnerable a queen could be at the hands of a king. I think this left a psychological imprint on Elizabeth's mind. I think the thought of marrying terrified her, quite frankly.
Elizabeth actually receives a deputation from the House of Commons not long after she becomes queen, where they petition her to marry. And she takes it in very good grace, but she says to them, you know, since I've been a child, I have decided that I'm going to remain unmarried, that I'm going to be a virgin. I'm going to reign as a virgin queen. And it doesn't really cause any stir, which is surprising, but it really is because just nobody believed her. It was a ridiculous suggestion that this young girl of 25 would hope to reign as queen. Of course she had to marry. Of course she had to give England a king. Her role was to produce heirs to continue the dynasty.
She was not going to get married. I will be master and mistress in my own kingdom. And on top of that, she made sure then she could barter with all these other countries for their hand.
But also, Elizabeth was determined, perhaps for the first time in her life, to have control over herself and of her kingdom. She had been left incredibly vulnerable by the downfall of her mother, and she had been delegitimised, she had been removed from the succession. And I think in a way, Elizabeth wanted to rule without a husband.
She was astute, she took her time, she didn't snatch at things like her father did. And she ruled us for nearly 45 years, against all the odds in many ways for ruling on her own. But actually, when you look at her Privy Council, there was nothing alone about it. She did fall in love with Robert Dudley, there's no question, and she did fall in love with his son, Essex.
Elizabeth and Robert Dudley had an incredibly close relationship. Indeed, she gave him the nickname My Eyes. She also moved his apartments incredibly close to her own, which may suggest indeed that there was an intimacy that went beyond friendship between them.
But I don't believe that Elizabeth slept with him. I don't believe Elizabeth went to bed with these men. I think we'd like to think so. It makes us more comfortable. Oh, it must have happened. Well, where's the evidence? I think she was going to be absolutely in control. She was never going to be blackmailed. She was going to make sure she knew what was what.
Cecil, I find you in my company yet again that you may moan about my beloved Robert Dudley. Are you doubting that I cannot make choices for myself? do you really think that I will allow any to climb upon my shoulders? I will not. I am Virgo intacta, and I intend to stay that way.
She might well have desired them. Was she not lusty? Was she not her father's daughter? She was. And that's the point. But she was the best of him. With her education and her femininity, I will argue, helped with that.
It's incredibly difficult to know what happened behind closed doors, and whether or not she did remain a virgin is almost beside the point. Elizabeth wanted to project herself as the Virgin Queen and was incredibly successful in doing so.
Mary, Queen of Scots, is undoubtedly Elizabeth's rival. They are two parallel queens, two queens in one aisle. Mary was born in 1542, and when she was 6 days old, she became reigning Queen of Scotland. She had a very troubled upbringing before being sent to France, where she was engaged to the French Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. She becomes Queen of France very briefly, but then when her husband dies, she returns to Scotland as an independent ruler. Mary is undoubtedly the biggest threat to Elizabeth, and this is because of her place in the English succession. Henry VIII, of course, had 3 children. None of them have any heirs. He has no surviving brothers, so his next heirs are his sisters, Margaret, the elder sister, and Mary, the younger. Margaret, the elder sister, is the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, so Mary is effectively her heir. She is the next hereditary heir to the throne. And this really matters to Elizabeth because Elizabeth is still legally illegitimate, so legally she has no title to the throne other than by Act of Parliament and by her father's will. When Mary Tudor, Mary I, dies, Mary, Queen of Scots, actually declares herself Queen of England because by the laws of hereditary she is next heir to the throne. Although she later abandons those claims, Elizabeth of course is well aware of Mary's position in the succession, and she is incredibly dangerous to Elizabeth's rule.
Mary, Queen of Scots was Elizabeth's first cousin, and she had something of a tempestuous rule in Scotland. Indeed, she was forced to abdicate her throne because of her actions.
And of course, she was being questioned about the death of her second husband, Darnley, who was a really horrible man, actually. That doesn't mean he's entitled to be murdered, or entitled to murder him, rather. But what it does mean is that she had some answering to do because he was very, very close to the English throne in succession. And he was, no doubt about it, murdered. Many people believed she was colluded with her third husband, Bothwell.
Mary was forced to flee to England and to seek refuge with her cousin Elizabeth. But Elizabeth knew that Mary, as a Catholic, would become a figurehead for those who opposed Elizabeth's rule. Indeed, people already thought that Mary had a more legitimate claim to the English throne.
After she realised she couldn't stay in Scotland any longer, Mary fled to England. And it was the absolute worst decision she could have taken because Elizabeth was the one person who could never allow Mary to have her freedom because Mary is such a threat to her rule.
So when Mary came here on the 2nd of February 1569, she was told, and this castle was absolutely vast and full of streets and crowded and horses moving around, all these things going on, she was told she was now a prisoner.
When Elizabeth hears that Mary has landed in the north of England, she orders that she be placed under house arrest. And Mary remains imprisoned by Elizabeth for 20 years.
So when she arrived here, there were these murders and death associated with her, and on top of that, she'd been locked up in Scotland. She'd escaped. There'd been the Battle of Langside, and she had escaped into England. So there's that. She'd left behind her son, James, who she'd signed over to for the regency of her bastard half-brother Murray. He'd been after it for a long time. And she'd lost her son, her kingdom, and her dignity. It must have been absolutely terrifying for her to come here and be told this. In fact, it was so terrifying that she vomited black blood, sign of an ulcer, collapsed across the neck of the horse, was held down. They made her walk in here. All this had happened, and she wasn't even 27. So you can see why some of the courts of Europe might have been a bit concerned about the choices that she'd made. And in fact, she historically, we have much record of her saying, "My heart is my own." Well, it isn't. She's not a shepherdess running through a field. Her heart and her womb belong to her people, and the decisions she makes should be for the purposes of trade and peace, for the nation's sake. And of course, Elizabeth was going to be a master and mistress in her own kingdom, wasn't she? That's a famous quote of hers. And Elizabeth had her locked up for nearly 19 years, so she was here 4 times in total, the last time for 11 months. And then the Babington plot happened and she went from here. And all of these things meant that this is a woman who was constantly confronted by betrayal.
Mary is desperate to come to court to plead her case with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth will not see her. Instead, Mary slowly begins to lose hope, and she starts plotting against Elizabeth. And there are several plots, at least, that her name is mentioned in or that she seems to have had direct involvement in. Lastly, of course, she is involved in the Babington plot, where she gives her consent to murder Elizabeth. In many respects, this is a really sensible policy for Mary, because actually, were Elizabeth to die at any point during Mary's imprisonment, it's really likely that Mary would be declared Queen of England. She knows that there's just one heartbeat between her and the English succession.
Elizabeth had perhaps been astute when imprisoning her cousin Mary, for indeed Mary did conspire to overthrow Elizabeth and to place herself on the English throne.
She didn't know that all was known. She didn't know that one of her closest associates was a double agent.
Elizabeth reluctantly signed her cousin's death warrant, and this was a really difficult move on Elizabeth's part. She knew that the execution of anointed queen could set a precedent. So we can perhaps understand Elizabeth's reluctance at making this move.
Of course, she was a tremendous, glamorous, tragic figure in our history.
Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, and her execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe, not least in Spain.
Mary's execution was a shocking event. She was an anointed queen, a monarch in her own right. It shocked Europe. While Mary's son James, who had his eye very much on the English throne, was prepared to forgive and forget in his relations with Elizabeth, Catholic Europe were outraged at the execution. Philip of Spain, England's former king, who had been on hostile terms with Elizabeth for several years, was equally outraged. He very much saw himself as a defender of Catholicism, and he took up Mary's cause. And it's really Mary's execution that lit the spark of war with Spain and ultimately leads to the Spanish Armada. The English were expecting an invasion from Spain, and Philip built a great fleet, the Spanish Armada, and it's not intended to be a naval fleet, it's intended to carry troops to England for a land-based invasion. Her commanders, Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake, are able to scatter the Spanish fleet, partly by aid of a Protestant wind that blows in the English favour. They send fire ships into the Spanish fleet, which burn the ships.
Elizabeth really showed her mettle at a speech that she gave at Tilbury, and this is where the mythology of Elizabeth really starts. The truth of the matter is that it was more the weather than anything that Elizabeth had done that was the downfall of the Armada.
The Armada is entirely scattered, and in fact the ships that remain have to sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland to get home to Spain because they just cannot go back down the English Channel. It is a triumph of Elizabeth's reign.
But this is where Elizabeth, the powerful Virgin Queen, really comes into prominence. It is at this point that the mythology of Elizabeth begins. During Elizabeth's reign, there is a burgeoning field of theatre and of entertainment. And of course, this is the age of Shakespeare, who produces an enormous body of works. We know that Elizabeth enjoys Shakespeare's plays at court, though it is questionable whether she actually met him or not. Not only can plays be used to rewrite history in favour of Elizabeth, but also they can be used for political advantage too. These plays are consumed by the masses, so this in a way is a great propaganda tool too.
And we know Elizabeth was a great propagandist, and she was determined to use this to create capital on a European stage. And one way that she did this is actually through iconography. We've got the Armada portrait, which was commissioned, and it shows Elizabeth in her absolute prime. You know, her dress is absolutely enormous. Her hair is big. She's looking powerful. Behind her, you can see the Spanish Armada being defeated. And it shows Elizabeth as the monarch that she wants to present to the world. She is a warrior queen. She is at the absolute height of her powers.
Elizabeth built on Henry VIII's reputation as a shipbuilder and as an explorer, and she gave license to people like Sir Francis Drake to go and explore and also to acquire, shall we say, funds from foreign battleships.
And then these sea captains appear. We're an island nation. We have Drake, faced like a pug in a high wind, but he was gifted gave her the equivalent of 4.6 million. The Sir Walter Raleigh, when he arrives at court with his cloak, beautiful young man. And who be you, sir? I be Water. So she called him my Water. And from then on, he signed his letters with a bucket. You can see this bucket on the bottom of letters.
But I think we can also see that this sense of exploration and licence to do so on Elizabeth's part was really the foundation of the British Empire. This is where the British Empire starts in earnest.
The Armada had been a great victory, but not much talked about. The following year was the Counter-Armada. We did badly at that, trying to relieve Portugal from Spain's attentions. But in the golden years of Elizabeth, we saw great peace that we weren't used to.
Elizabeth was destined to be the last of her dynasty, and of course she knew this. She had no children, she had no nephews and nieces, there was no one else to carry on the Tudor line. So in part, of course, her legacy is dynastic change and the fact that the King of Scots became the King of England and united the two kingdoms. But her legacy is so much more than this. Although she's not the first English reigning queen or the first reigning queen in the island of Britain, she was undoubtedly the woman that proved that women could reign in England. She reigned for over 40 years and she reigned independently. She didn't have a king and she was very much in control of her kingdom.
War of the Roses had ripped the guts out of us. Though the whole world wondered at this extraordinary woman. And they were right to. She had loved us, genuinely loved us. And as she said later on in life in her golden speech, "You are the greatest jewel in my crown," meaning the people. It was right.
And I think that's her greatest legacy, really. It is her contribution to English queenship. All subsequent reigning queens have to some extent modelled themselves on Elizabeth. We see this with Queen Anne in the 18th century, for example, who, when she becomes queen, she actually takes as her motto, Semper Idem, always the same. And this was the motto of Elizabeth I. And so this is her legacy. She is the first truly great reigning queen on the island of Britain. And very much this is a legacy that she passed on to subsequent generations.
Actually, I think one of Elizabeth's greatest legacies was demonstrating that a queen could rule in her own right without a man. She was a queen who did not need a king. Elizabeth died childless, and at the end of her reign came the end of the Tudor dynasty. I think Elizabeth's greatest legacy was bringing a sense of national identity to England once more.
The Tudor dynasty is an era of such big characters. We have Henry VIII, we have Anne Boleyn, we have Elizabeth I, but we also have non-royals. We have Thomas Cromwell, we have William Cecil, we have Robert Dudley trying to marry the Queen.
I think we're all still so obsessed with the Tudors because of how unrealistic it all is. If this had been the work of fiction, we would think it was pushing credulity.
These individuals are so interesting in themselves. And it's also an age of big events. It's where the Reformation happens. It's the age of William Shakespeare. So we have the stage, we have the first permanent theatres. It's the age of exploration. We have Sir Walter Raleigh attempting to plant his first European colony in the New World. There are big events and there are big personalities. And There are also surprising things like the 6 wives of Henry VIII, which really draws people's attention because it was unprecedented. It was seen as bizarre, even crazy, that the king had 6 wives back in the 16th century, and today it still holds our interest.
I mean, this is a family who killed one another. This is a family who had a king with 6 queens who killed 2 of them. This is a family with feuding siblings. It has everything for us to enjoy, and we can't get enough of it.
There was no dynasty like the Tudor dynasty for drama.